Prepare yourself, you're about to listen to another episode of the Good is Dumb podcast. The sworn enemy of good's dumbness, and the podcast for all us dummies who fear God more than they fear men. Now here are your hosts, L and CB.
Welcome to it, it's CB here, and as always I'm joined by my beautiful and talented wife, L. Welcome to the first ever episode of Good is Dumb podcast. So, because it's the first episode, we thought we'd start off with kind of talking about why we wanted to do this podcast. So, Elle, why don't you start with why you wanted to do this?
I think, for me, part of the main reason that I wanted to start this podcast is because I know there are a lot of other people like us. We're not the only ones that have these thoughts or these things that we question in our government and in our society. And I think it's just good for the people to have a voice. And I guess we just want to create a community where we can talk about things freely, and how we see things here in Canada.
Yeah, and I think for me too, growing up, I was always very influenced by talk radio from the States. But I never thought that I would do something like this, start a podcast or anything like that. But I think for me personally, just seeing what our society has begun to adopt as good and how many people are falling for, frankly, the lies and the deceits of Satan, it's just really kind of driving me up the wall, especially with the tyrannical rule of the government in our lives, intruding ever more into our lives. And for me, it's just, like my wife said, I think there's a lot of people that feel this way. I think there's a lot of people that share our viewpoint. It's just, because we're conservative people, we want to be good citizens. We don't want to have to speak badly about other people or about our society, but at the same time, there comes a point where you have to stand up and be counted. And so for me, this podcast is me trying to do that in the best way that I think that God has called me. So yeah, that for me is kind of my motivation. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Al, but one of the things that one of the reasons we called this podcast Good is Dumb podcast.
Yeah,
is
that
because,
might be a good place to start.
Yeah, is one, it's because what society is calling good is frankly moved beyond the realm of disagreeing with my own personal position or the conservative position, and it's moved into something that is a flat out lie, and frankly, you have to be dumb. You have to be without any critical thinking skills to believe what our society is calling good is actually good.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
The flip side of that is that people like us who fear God and who believe in the traditional values of Western society, that are being destroyed by the good in our society, the woke in our society, we're called dumb because we still fear God more than we fear man. And I think that's kind of the dual meaning of why we called this podcast the Good is Dumb podcast.
Yeah. And that kind of sums it up right there.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
No, I think that the rest of society kind of just sees us as, dumb, like you said.
So we kind of wanted to start today with something that I came across on Facebook. I was actually very disappointed by who posted this, because I actually know this person personally. He's a pastor. I won't say his name because I don't think that's fair to him. And again, because I do know him personally, and I think that to be fair to him, this is something that I should discuss personally with him if I was going to use his name. But it just kind of sums up the general thinking of...
It just even shows the division between in like the Christian church.
Yeah. It just highlights kind of the like Elle just said, like it kind of highlights just the other side of the argument from our viewpoint on whether or not the government has a right to violate the church's right to worship.
Yeah.
And I read this article, and this article was posted on the Gospel Coalition, which tends to be a fairly conservative evangelical site. And the article was written by Pastor Paul Martin, and it's titled, "Is Civil Disobedience the Only Option?" And for those of you who don't know who Paul Martin is, he's a pastor at Grace Fellowship Church here in Toronto. So it's basically about the lockdowns, and his article is a response to basically our viewpoint that the government has no right to violate our right to worship, even given COVID. And therefore, it's becoming more and more apparent that civil disobedience is the answer to the government.
Well, it's not even like civil maybe disobedience, but it's not like we're not being lawful citizens. We are, adhering to the Canadian
Charter of Rights and
Freedoms. So it's not like we're not obeying the law. We're just standing up for our rights in this country.
Yeah, and I think that's the most disappointing piece of this article, and I'll get to the article in a minute, is just the main idea seems to be that because COVID exists, our rights can be violated. And if that's and essentially this is the grand argument that's essentially taking place in our society right now is, do we want to live in a society that is safe, or do we want to live in Western civilization where freedom and the individual's rights trump safety?
Yeah, and well, what is safety, right?
Right.
And who's the one that holds that definition? So
right, because from our viewpoint, it's even like, can the government even provide that? Like what the society today is essentially saying is, by doing these things that the government has mandated and allowing the government to come in and violate our rights, which, by the way, if we allow that and we do nothing, then become privileges. If we allow the government to do that, then we're believing that the government has the capability to prevent us from dying. And last time I read my scriptures, it says that Jesus holds the key to Hades. God is the only one that determines the days allotted to each person in their life. And so God is the only one that can save us spiritually. God is the only one that sustains us physically. It's not the government. And so, like, our position is essentially, yes, the government can advise citizens about how to best deal with this virus, but they're now mandating that advice for citizens and violating our rights. This article, again, by Paul Martin, titled, "Is Civil Disobedience the Only Option?" So he starts off with saying, talking about Ontario Regulation 654-20, which is essentially the regulation that was passed that started the lockdown in Toronto, that began in the last week of November. And in this, he essentially is saying, and I'll quote here, is he says, as strong as my opinions are about the nature of COVID-19 and the response of governments and epidemiologists across the world, I cannot hold my opinions about these things in the same certainty. I am not omniscient. I do not see into the hearts of humans and what motivates them. I am not privy to some secret chamber of worldwide decision-making, but I still know my Bible is true. So here he's trying to conflate, he's trying to say that because we don't know everything about the coronavirus, we can't say that the government is violating our rights, because he's essentially saying if the coronavirus is as deadly as the government's saying it is, then we should allow the government to violate our rights. And again, this is what I was talking about earlier, is that presents a society in which your rights are just privileges that can be taken away and violated according to whatever the current wisdom of man is in your society at that time.
Yep.
Another interesting thing he says here is, quoting him again, is, so I take issue with one side charging the other with cowardice, as I do the cowards charging the others with being too political. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. We simply must leave space to disagree with each other on this matter. Don't forget we have an experienced and wicked enemy trying to deceive us into division, disunity, and every violation of love. So here he's trying to say we should disagree on this and allow each other to disagree on this, because we don't want to cause division. But if we allow the government to violate our rights as the church, then essentially we are allowing them to destroy us in terms of worldly understanding and worldly standing in society. And so it doesn't matter if I make you uncomfortable by being morally courageous. And he's right. We will each give an account of ourselves to God. And if that's the case, God's Son going to the cross can cover a multitude of sins, including moral cowardice. Your thoughts on this, Elle?
It just made me chuckle a little bit. That, of course, no, God, or Christ dying on the cross will cover our sins and cowardice, but we are called up, to be bold, and we have not been given a spirit of fear or of timidity. So we should be standing up to the government, I look at places in the Bible where other characters stood up to the government of their day, who were trying to oppress them and just make them follow their beliefs. When you look at David, you look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Daniel, Esther.
Yeah.
Even Moses, like essentially what he's arguing here is that because, and he mentions this in the article, because God says that we are to obey the civil authorities, he's essentially saying that means that because the civil authorities are established and by God and therefore we are to obey them, that means they can take the place of God and they can speak for God. And that's very dangerous when it's clear that these people do not follow God, they do not honor God, they do not know God. They mock God openly. They go against his will. And I find it amazing that he writes this article essentially advocating that what we need right now is a discussion. We need to continue to plead with the government not to violate our rights while the government continues to violate our rights. And yet he writes, I do not think God is pleased by lip service. It didn't work out too well for King Saul. I used to teach my kids that to obey means do it all, do it now, and do it with a happy heart. That seems to some of the biblical teaching on the matter. If God has told us to obey our governing authorities, then we are to do it now, and perhaps most difficult of all, do it with a happy heart. This was the added advantage of making it clear when and if we decided not to obey the government directive.
I have to strongly disagree with what this pastor is saying, because you think about places where people live in communism and they're not allowed to go to church. They still have the underground church. The Great Commission doesn't stop or doesn't die because of that. Our first we first answer to God, right? Then to the government, if you'd like. So the government doesn't trump our duties and what we need to do, what God has called us to do. And it's just really, I think it's just really sad, and just to see these Christian leaders proclaim this and just say this. And because they're just bringing other people to follow them.
Yeah, and I think like he's talking about to obey means not only talking, but actual doing. And I think that's our position is God has called us to fulfill the Great Commission. God calls us in Hebrew not to abandon fellowship together and worship together. And that's exactly what the government is telling us, that church isn't essential. That we are going to decide, not Jesus Christ, whether you get to fulfill the Great Commission, how you get to fulfill the Great Commission, when you get to open your doors as a church, when you get to gather as a church, when that's not the government's role. That's Christ's role as head of the church.
I also think about the lepers, and how people wouldn't go up to the lepers, but, Jesus went up to them. So I'm not saying that the coronavirus isn't, real. In no way am I saying that, but I'm like, why are we afraid of this when we have Christ? To live is for Christ and to die is gain. We should not be afraid of this. And if we trust in our God, we should trust that He will protect us in this and in this time and in all times, not just this time. So I just feel like it just shows a lack of trust and a lack of belief in who our God is.
Yeah, and I think too, everything will be submitted under God the Father in the end. And it says in Scripture, everything is made for and made by Jesus Christ for Him. So if you understand that, then governments are to submit to Jesus Christ as Lord. And governments do not get to assume the role of Jesus Christ over the church, because we are only to follow Christ. And the thing that got me the most wasn't this namby-pamby idea of we need to sing Kumbaya and only talk about things and just hope we get along and try and convince people who don't want to be convinced, frankly, and don't actually care to listen to us in the first place, that we should be open instead of demanding that we should be open because Christ calls us to be open. Mm-hmm. It was when he wrote in this article near the end, he says, "We think what is most needed in these days of lockdowns and conspiracies and competing data sets is a whole bunch of Canadian pulpits with faithful men who continue to open the Word of God with more conviction about its truthfulness than anything else." So essentially, we as Christians are not to view the government lockdowns as a violation of our rights. Instead, we're supposed to shut up about that and continue as best we can, as the government violates our rights, to preach in the pulpits, which again we can't do because the government is violating our rights. And the other thing I want to say is he's painting everyone who disagrees with the government's violation of our rights as conspiracy theorists. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because that's one of the things that's really bugged me, is in our society we have the Premier of Ontario, and he gets up there every day and he has a whole bunch of health experts, and I'm using quotations, health experts, stand up and talk to us about the coronavirus. And they use very little data. They use very little medical reporting, medical studies to support why we need these lockdowns, why we need these mandates. Mm-hmm. And so it's not actually competing data sets. They don't use a data set. We just think they're using a data set because they have doctor at the beginning of their name. Mm-hmm. And the other thing too is it's not a conspiracy to say there's a whole bunch of data that says that having schools open is not an issue at all. In fact, the Toronto Sick Kids, which is one of the premier children's hospitals in Toronto, in Ontario, in Canada, in the world, released a report in earlier this year in June or July stating that schools should absolutely be open. But did you ever hear that data set being talked about by any of the politicians or the medical experts, again in quotation marks? No. And again, we just had a study done in Denmark with a control group, scientific study about masks. And they found no statistical difference between those who went out wearing masks in public and those who went out and did not wear masks in public in terms of how much they contracted the coronavirus. And the other thing we know is that the coronavirus only affects those who are going to die anyway this year. That was another study that got released that got buried by the political establishment that looked at the United States. This is in the United States, and it looked at the average rate, the average number of deaths per year in the United States, and found that the coronavirus actually is not causing a giant spike between 2019 and 2020 in terms of the number of deaths. It's only killing the people who are going to die anyway. And the other thing too is that we have a data set that says that the infection mortality rate amongst people who participate in the economy, which is those under the age of 70, when compared to the flu, the infection mortality rate for coronavirus is equal to, if not half that of the flu. And yet we're shutting down our entire society and violating our rights over a disease that has a 95 plus, depending on your age group, recovery rate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know why we don't just shut down every year then for the flu.
Right, exactly.
Right? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. If you think about it logically, and I think that's what gets me. Like, first of all, people don't do their research and they just believe everything that the government spews. And they also don't do their research and they don't think logically. I think that's a huge thing. Just like even if you're not necessarily a believer in Christ, think logically. Think for yourself. Just put, 2 and 2 together, and you'll come with an outcome that's different than what the narrative is.
Yeah, so this has been my biggest frustration. And I'm going to talk about one more study, but there was a study that came out last week that talked about states who had mask mandates versus states who didn't have mask mandates. And it showed that case numbers, which again is a garbage statistic, because what do I care if I have it if I'm not dying from it, is case numbers in states where there were stricter lockdown measures and mask mandates are still seeing a spike in COVID-19 cases, and states in which masks weren't mandated and the lockdown measures were less strict are actually starting to see a decline in the number of cases in their population.
Yeah, well, where's that thing that in Europe where it was done, where they decided to go with herd immunity? What country was that again?
Yeah, Sweden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so they did statistics. This was 2 or 3 weeks ago now. They looked at the number of deaths in the European Union with the second wave of COVID-19. And it looked like a rocket shot out from the Florida space station. And it just went straight up. And Sweden's spiked a little bit along with the initial phase of the second wave spike with the European Union. And then it went down, and if it could, it would have gone off the graph. Because that's how far down it was and how non-existent the deaths are in Sweden, because they implemented herd immunity. Unlike the European Union, which had massive lockdowns. And it just goes to show that this the measures they're implementing have nothing to do with the virus because they're not even following natural epidemiology, which states that, and again, this is why we have vaccines for other diseases. You need herd immunity either by natural means or by a vaccine to overcome certain diseases. And so until recently, we didn't have a vaccine. We didn't even know if a vaccine was coming until recently. And so natural herd immunity makes sense. So Sweden already has natural herd immunity. The rest of us don't. That's why we keep seeing these massive spikes in deaths. Because we don't have any herd immunity. And again, it just goes to show that these lockdown measures have nothing to do, have less to do with the virus and more to do with instilling fear in the population to allow a government takeover of every aspect of your life.
Yeah. Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense to me if you think about it.
Yeah, and I think like moving on here, I think on a lighter note, like we don't want to be civilly disobedient towards the government, but at the same time, there comes a time where there's a line in the sand, and if the government crosses that line, aka violates our rights without impunity, and we just allow that as a society, the government is not going to give that power back.
No. Has that ever happened in history?
Yeah, it's never happened in history where a government has had more power than it's ever had and then has just benevolently given that back to the population. But I think switching gears here, we are approaching the end of the year, and we have a lot to be thankful for because God is good.
All the time.
And all the time, God is good. And I think that one of the things everyone looks forward to every year is Time's Person of the Year. And this year they have candidates like Joe Biden, President-elect Joe Biden, President Donald Trump, Andrew Cuomo, which is a garbage pick, given the number of old people he's killed in nursing homes. Ariana Grande was even on the list. I don't know what she's done this year, but she was on the list. But I like the Babylon Bee's take on who should be Person of the Year. So their take is that Karen should be named Times Person of the Year. And I think this kind of like sums up kind of where our society's going, is we have a whole bunch of Karens that are trying to create this nanny state in which the state has full control over your life so that you can be quote unquote safe. And I love how the Babylon Bee reported the reactions to this announcement. They said the announcement was met with mixed reaction and fierce debate. Some Karens have celebrated the news as a huge step forward for Karen representation and human rights. Other Karens took issue with the cover photo and demanded to speak to the manager of Time magazine, because the cover photo that they're referencing to is a white woman. So obviously that should be a black woman, or I guess in our wokeness and our goodness in society, it should be a trans black woman of some sort. Maybe even a trans black pregnant woman would be good. And so some have even questioned Time choosing Karen in 2020 after already choosing Greta Thunberg last year, who is kind of like a climate Karen. So yeah, it just highlights the Times bias. Again, we know the Times is biased to the left, but now it's highlighting just the Times bias towards Karens. So I really liked Babylon Bee's take on Times Person of the Year, because I think Karen is very well deserving this year, especially because the government has seemed to have taken the position of Karen in our lives. So another thing we're going to talk about is this is from someone who I know, and again, it's another Facebook post that I came across, and and just so that just to demonstrate that we take equal opportunity here at the Good is Dumb podcast to call out Good's dumbness. We're not just going to call out people in the church And on our side for being dumb, we're also going to call out what society has deemed good and the dumbness of the woke. So this person wrote a very masterful take on just how simplistic issues can be when you're woke. So this person wrote, basic human rights should not be a political debate. Black people do not deserve to get killed based on their skin color. Indigenous people should receive fresh and clean water. LGBTQ2IA plus people, which I had to correct in this person's post because they only put LGBTQ, and how discriminatory is that, should not be killed or harassed solely because of their sexual orientation. Transgender individuals should not be denied the access to health care based on their gender identity. And Muslim and Islamic people should have places to practice their religion. All of these things are basic human rights that certain minority groups do not currently have. I'm not sure what world he lives in or what country he's living in, even though he lives just a couple cities over from me. But apparently that's the way it is. Those rights are not a political matter. Absolutely no one should have their basic human rights stripped from them based on who they are. And if you disagree with that, then you gladly remove me off Facebook, because I do not tolerance, again, not tolerate, but I do not tolerance this sort of ignorance. Again, just demonstrating the wokes, the goodness is dumbness. And when I read this, I again, this just is the perfect highlight for what we were talking about earlier about why we named this show Good is Dumb. Because these simplistic statements are not founded in any reality that I know of. That you have to be so stupid to take these statements at face value and say that is these things should be championed and these are actual reality in order to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. So I'm just going to take them one by one. So, like, black people do not deserve to get killed based on their skin color. Who in the heck in our society disagrees with that?
Nobody.
Right. But the problem is that what they mean by that is police officers, white people who aren't woke, they're just killing black people.
Left, right, and center?
Yeah, based on their skin color. And I gotta say, if that's the case, then somehow white people have the worst shots in the history of mankind. North American white people in the 21st century have the worst shots in mankind's history. And also, show me one example of that. Like, let's even take George Floyd. The biggest example, apparently, of how systemically racist our society is. Let's take George Floyd. There has yet to be a shred of evidence that what happened to George Floyd, which is horrible, was racially motivated. There is no evidence that has come out to suggest that the white cop killed George Floyd because he didn't like black people. And like, okay, let's move on to the next one. Indigenous people should receive fresh and clean water. Sure. And what that's referring to is the government's inability to provide fresh and clean water for you. Well, yeah, that's why you shouldn't rely on the government to do things for your community. That's why you should take personal responsibility for yourself. Mm-hmm. That's again why we're saying, yeah, maybe we need a little less government in our life.
Yeah, we can't just, yeah.
And let's take the next one. LGBTQ2IA plus people should not be killed or harassed solely because of their sexual orientation. Again, who disagrees with this?
Yeah, I don't know, like, obviously there's there's racist people. There is, people who are like, I guess they don't like the LGBTQ2IA people. But, like, nobody agrees with that. No Christian, no one that I know conservative or not conservative agrees with that notion, with that fact that, that just because of your sexual orientation you should be harassed or murdered, or because of your skin color, like, people should be free to live their life and pursue happiness for themselves.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then transgender individuals should not be denied the access to healthcare based on their gender identity.
Is that?
Well, I'm sorry. If you don't have a vagina, just because you identify as a woman, I'm not going to waste taxpayer dollars by performing services for health, by providing you with health services that examine the health of a vagina, because you don't have one.
I'm just kind of confused. I feel like this one's kind of like very kind of vague. Like, what, are they not allowed to go to the doctors? Like, what? They get healthcare, like I don't know. I've never heard of anything, like what he's trying to say there, that, they get denied access to healthcare based on their gender identity.
Yeah, exactly.
I've never heard that.
That's why the only thing I can think of is that, like, the doctor will treat you, because, again, they only look at your biology, as a biological male because your biology is male. As opposed to a biological female because you identify as female even though you're a man. It's the only thing I can think of that they're talking about here. Mm. And we actually know that some procedures that if they're done on a person who may identify as a woman but has a biology of a man, they can actually be very dangerous and kill you.
So why would you want to have that done?
And then last one is Muslim and Islamic people should have places to practice their religion. First of all, again, like you said, who disagrees with that? And second of all, this person has clearly not been to Brampton, where I grew up for 25 years.
Yeah. And just like even like where we are now, just I see mosques, I see like
we were driving through the countryside and there was this massive mosque on this huge property. And it's just like, that's what I mean. What reality does this person live in?
They should have freedom of association and freedom to practice their religious beliefs. That's their choice. But no one anywhere and in their right mind, let's make that a key point, in their right mind, has ever or would agree with any of these points. Disagree with any of these points. Like, we all agree on this.
Yeah, I know. And yet he's acting like, and this is clear because I know some other statements that he's made. He's acting like conservatives disagree with these things. And that conservatives want black people to die because of their skin color, want indigenous people to die because they don't have fresh and clean water, want LGBTQ people to be harassed, want transgender individuals to be denied access to healthcare.
But then that's also like saying that all black people, all LGBTQ people, they're all liberals and none of them are conservatives. That's also a myth right there in itself.
Right. Right. That's the other thing is being one is not mutually exclusive from being the other.
Yeah.
But again, in our society, what we've declared good is identity politics. And so everyone has to be put in a box. And those boxes, there's a diversity of boxes that you can be put in that all mean that you have the ideology of communism. And the only box outside that is Christian conservatism. And when you're in that box, it's not labeled Christian conservatives. You're just labeled the enemy. You're labeled irredeemable. You're labeled good for nothing. You're labeled clingers to God and guns. Right? Like these things, these people are just, and I've seen this rise in people more and more, but they're just starting to behave like godless animals. Where if you simply disagree with me, or if you simply have a different viewpoint than me, I need to destroy you.
Yeah, and then they preach love and understanding and acceptance and all that stuff. No, but only if you agree with me.
Right, and this is why we say good is dumb, because what society views as good is completely dumb.
That's so illogical. The fact that there's no common sense, no logic, no really frustrates me. And it just, like, I just think, just logically, like, you know, putting the Bible and our Christian beliefs aside, just think logically, you know, just make coherent thoughts and go along those lines, you know, of, you know what, I'm going to love everybody. I'm going to love people who agree with me, disagree with me, whatever, you know. Don't just preach it, but, you know, as soon as someone disagrees with you, just start screaming and having a mental breakdown and I'm going to kill you. I'm going to, you know, threaten them and all this stuff. Like,
yeah, and I think, like, this just goes back to what we were talking about before. If we allow the government to decide who gets to enjoy what rights and what rights you can enjoy at the will of the government, then you no longer have a society in which those who disagree, who dissent from the government line,
mm-hmm.
have any standing in society. Mm-hmm. And that is called tyranny. And that's why people have to start standing up. And two people, and we're going to switch gears here, and two people that did stand up in the month of November, and I want to, this is kind of our first segment doing this, but we're going to try every month to come up with what we call dummies of the month. So these are dummies like us who fear God more than they fear man, who are standing up to the government's violation of rights, who are standing up for principles, who are standing up for not just their own rights, but everyone's right to do that, as it is laid out in the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the first person is the first dummy of the month. It's going to be two people this time, not just one. The first dummy of the month is Adam Skelly, the owner of Adamson Barbecue in Etobicoke. And I'm sure by now you've heard of this, but following 3 days of keeping his restaurant open and 3 days of violating the shutdown orders, he was charged and arrested by police for exercising his charter rights and trying to keep his livelihood and everything that he worked for from being destroyed. And the counter argument to him was that, and this was put forth by Professor Carrie Frock, a law professor at the University of New Brunswick. She said, all these people waving the charter around need to know that what the charter actually says. We do have the right to make individual decisions, but the question is, when do those rights start to infringe on the rights of other people? So you explain to me how Adam Skelly, by opening his restaurant in complete compliance with the highest law of the land, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and exercising his rights, violated anyone else's rights. All the people that went there voluntarily decided to go eat at his restaurant because it was open.
They went out of their own volition.
Yeah.
Like, that was their choice. They made that choice. He didn't, like, drag people into his restaurant.
Yeah, and I think this just underscores the elitist thinking that they're the ones who care about everyone and we don't care about anyone else.
Yeah.
When in fact they only care about themselves. And just like Doug Ford, who keeps getting on and says, "Oh, well, I feel so bad for these businesses," and then sends cop cars to go arrest a business owner trying to survive.
Yeah.
Like it just there's a complete disconnect between what they're saying for the rest of us to do and what they're doing.
Yeah. And keep in mind, like, I understand, like, if they were to, I guess, shut down his operation because he's been, and this has recently come out, that he's been operating his business without a license for over 4 years. That's one thing, but that's not why they did it, right? They found that after the fact. And also, what about, and let's say it wasn't Adam Skelly who did this. What if it was another person who, had his license and everything, and decided to do this and, open their business, then the government would have no right at all to do what they did. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, like, I do understand that, yes, he was operating without a business license, and that I understand was wrong. But the fact of the matter is that's not what we're trying to highlight here. What we're trying to highlight is all the businesses, all the small businesses that are being shut down and are being affected, and people's livelihoods that are being affected because of this mandated lockdown.
Yeah, like how can you say that a grocery store that serves fresh food every day to people, just like a restaurant, can be open, but arbitrarily the restaurants can't be open?
Yeah, and the restaurants, they had physical distancing in them. And when I go grocery shopping, I don't see anyone be like, holding out a stick, making sure we're 2 meters apart or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, like, and Doug Ford came under fire for this. The other thing is, Doug Ford came under fire because he was allowing the big box stores, even non-essential ones, to remain open.
Mm-hmm.
But the small business people, because again, those people, the big corporations, are part of the elitist group, so they get special protected status, right? Because they're the elites. We're just the common, unwashed masses. Mm-hmm. They're the elites, so they get privilege and they get status, and they don't have to follow all the rules like we do. And meanwhile, people's livelihoods, people's small businesses are being destroyed. Even not even their livelihoods, but like some of these businesses were started by their fathers or their grandfathers.
Some of these are started by immigrants and people of color, right, and LGBTQ people.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like, yeah, and I think that's perfect what you just said, because that's the thing. It's not about Adam Skelly and Adamson Barbecue in Etobicoke.
Yeah.
It's about all the small businesses that are arbitrarily shut down because the elites think that we're not capable of making our own personal decisions and taking care of our health. And so they need to come in and control our lives so that we can see the light. We can become woke. We can become good. We can become redeemable in their eyes. When all we should care about is how I live my life, because, like the pastor, who I disagreed with earlier, was saying, we will each have to give an account at the end of our life to Christ. And that kind of transitions into the second dummy of the month. So the second dummy of the month is Dr. Aaron Rock, who's the head pastor at Harvest Bible Church in Windsor. And he kind of wrote an article in November that prompted the article from Pastor Paul Martin to be written, in which he said it's titled Divine Obedience Over Civil Disobedience, and he argues, again, what we're arguing for, what our basic viewpoint on this show is the need not to throw out the Western baby with the bathwater. We can't throw out Western civilization and freedom for tyranny, because I don't care if I get vaccinated from this virus and things return to normal, if I've now lost all my freedoms because the government has violated all my rights and continues to say, oh, well, we have to protect you. We have to keep you safe. So we get to decide when you get to exercise those no longer rights, but privileges. What privileges you can have, what privileges we as the elite can have. They get to arbitrarily decide that.
Yeah, they get to dictate our lives. What happened to, your own person? What happened to you get to make your own decisions? I'm an adult now. I don't need my mom, or, my parents holding my hand and telling me what to do. And in this case, it would be the government. No, we're our own people, that should be able to make our own decisions.
Yeah, and in this article, he essentially argues that Christians, the church, needs to demand that we're essential, because again, we submit to Christ. We do not submit to the government, and begin to support the higher laws such as our right to worship and our right to religious expression, as outlined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, over health experts' public mandates to keep us safe from a virus. And again, like we mentioned earlier, we think this is very biblical. Like Daniel, in the story of Daniel was thrown into the lion's den because he violated the law. But according to Dr. Paul Martin, he should have worshipped Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar was a power established by God over him.
Mm-hmm. Well, think of the first church, right? The first church, and how all the Christians were being killed and all that stuff because they didn't hail to Rome and to the head of government at that time.
Yeah, Caesar.
Which was Caesar, yeah. So and they, you could say, rebelled or whatever it is, and they were killed for that.
Yep.
Literally crucified for their beliefs, but yet somehow, I don't know, like, we're not supposed to do that anymore. That doesn't, those biblical truths don't apply to today.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't, as a Christian, how can you say that? How can you, look back at that and say, yeah, you know what, we should just sit back and let the government, take advantage of us.
Yeah, and I think not only take advantage of us, but cause us to
sin.
Cause us to sin by worshiping them.
Yeah, because we're holding
as the highest authority.
Yeah, we're holding them as the highest authority and not God.
Christ. Yeah.
Not Christ, not God. So.
And I think like unlike Dr. Paul Martin, who's saying, oh, we need to have a conversation, we need to keep convincing them, we need to keep talking to them over and over and over again until they don't, even though they don't listen and they don't care. Dr. Aaron Rock is actually doing what Pastor Paul Martin says we should do, in that he's not just saying that we should do this. He's actually prepared to violate lockdown orders in Windsor, and he was actually at Queen's Park this past Sunday, holding a rally at Queen's Park,
which no one has talked about, by the way.
Yeah, which if it was anyone else except Christians, would have been all over the news because there were tons of people there. And so he's not only just talking the talk, he's walking the walk and following Christ.
Yeah. He's not just saying all this stuff.
Yeah. And I'm sorry if this makes you feel uncomfortable as someone who disagrees with Dr. Aaron Rock, but you are morally spineless. You are cowards. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, that's not because I said that to you. It's because Christ is convicting you of that. Mm-hmm. And that should be the only reason that you decide to be morally courageous or morally cowardice, is at the behest and leadership of Christ in your life. Like Paul Martin writes in that article, about how, well, we shouldn't make people feel bad because they disagree, or put them in awkward situations where they feel like they have to choose between the church and the government. And it's like, why? I shouldn't run my life on what other people are saying.
Well, doesn't the gospel make you uncomfortable? Yeah. Shouldn't God's truth make you uncomfortable and reveals that how you were dead? So in the first place, just like from the basics of our religious beliefs, we're meant to feel uncomfortable right from the start.
Right. And I think that the reason you feel uncomfortable, the reason you may feel like you're caught between the government and Christ, is because, one, they're opposed to each other, and two, because Christ is calling you to him and he's convicting you of your moral cowardice. And so I, as a Christian, yes, should not go out of my way to make the weaker brother stumble. But if God is clearly calling us, and I think it's clear, to follow him and worship him instead of the government, I don't have a choice but to do that because Christ is the headship of my life, not other people. Mm-hmm. And this rally that was held at Queen's Park, I'll let you talk about it, but we actually went there because we want you to know that we're not just people that talk the talk, but we actually walk the walk as well, both in our personal life and in our public life. And we were actually there, and Elle, I'll let you speak to this. Like, what was it like for you going to something like that? Because we had never been to a protest before.
Yeah, that was our first protest. Honestly, it made me very emotional going there. Just seeing God's people come together like this, and it wasn't divided into just Baptists or just just Pentecostals. No, it was like different groups of God's people. We had like Mennonites there. We had Catholics and Orthodox, and for me it was just and we had families, and it was a protest to worship, and it was a peaceful protest, right? We were just there exerting our rights as Christians, founded in this great country of Canada, to worship our God. And it was encouraging for someone like me. It was encouraging, being in this lockdown for so many months now. It was just encouraging to see that the people of God are not asleep, and that they are awake to what is happening, and that they will fight for their right to worship our God, and what God has called us to do, the Great Commission, and I think about how it is a right for pastors, or like how pastors are essential. Pastors are frontline workers. They deal with the sick. They deal with the dying. They deal with marriages that are falling apart, kids that are abused, people who are contemplating suicide. These are frontline workers. And you think about, everything that's been happening in this lockdown. And
sorry, technical difficulty.
And we need that. We need people to help, to not just be there for us physically, like doctors and all that stuff, though we do need that, but we need more than that. Man will not live on bread alone, but by every word that comes from God. And so we need this spiritual healing. We need these pastors who can help us spiritually and emotionally. So yes, these are essential people. They are essential to our society and to our fabric in this society. So I don't know. It was really just heartwarming and like touching, just to see all these people ready to stand up for their Creator.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest takeaway for me too, is encouraging. Just to touch on that point you kind of were ending with is unlike what the government, what the woke, what the quote unquote good people in society today, those who are called good by our society today, believe, we're not godless animals. We're not just a biological flesh suit. We're actually spiritual beings made in the image of God. And so, like you were just talking about, Elle, we don't just need food. We also need every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And that is given to us by the preaching of the word every Sunday at church. And so, you're absolutely right. Church is essential. Just as much as grocery stores and healthcare clinics are. Because we're not just biological beings. We're spiritual beings made in the image of God. And for me going there, it was, one, because and this is why we started this podcast. I felt, I'll let you speak for you. I felt that it was time to be counted. It was time to stand up and say, enough is enough. This is a line in the sand. We're not going to let you continue to violate our rights. We're going to stand on the truth that Christ has given us. And we're going to stand up for our right to worship. And what you were saying earlier, and by doing that, we're not just standing up for our right to worship as Christians. We're standing up for everyone's right to worship.
Yeah.
Because Christians are the only ones. In fact, a majority of the human population believes that we're not just biological creatures, that we're actually spiritual beings as well. And so we're standing up for everyone else's right to worship, even though we may disagree with who they worship or how they worship or why they worship, who they choose to worship. And I think that for me, it was just encouraging. It felt like I had, for a brief time, entered a world that was sane. Because our society has decided that we're so terrified of this virus that we can't do anything. We can't go see family. We can't hug each other. We can't sit at the dinner table together. We can't run our businesses, and so we can allow our children to starve and have our livelihoods destroyed. And us Christians, because we have Christ, are able to say, I don't have anything to fear from this virus. Even if it kills me, I don't have anything to fear because my hope is in Jesus Christ, who never fails.
Yeah.
And so it was a group of people saying, I'm not afraid of this virus, unlike all the rest of you people in the world. All the rest of you godless animals. I'm not afraid of this virus. And so we were standing up and saying, I'm not afraid of this virus. The church is essential. And because I'm not afraid of this virus, if you allow the churches to open, we will go to the most vulnerable in society. We want to serve the most vulnerable in society, to prevent this rise that we've seen in domestic abuse, in child suicide, in suicide in general, in poverty, and all these things that are afflicting our country. The church is perfectly situated to remedy, because Christ is the only one that can save us. So for me, being encouraged was the biggest thing, and a lot of people were there. Like I said earlier, it wasn't the biggest group ever. Like, it wasn't like 50,000 people or something like to go see the Blue Jays in a playoff game or something like that. But it was encouraging to see that many people turn out, and because it wasn't a massive amount of people, it was a good amount of people. It was also encouraging to see that even though the vast majority of Canadians disagree, the church was willing to follow Christ and not follow the quote-unquote experts, the elite in our society, who are just abandoning and openly mocking Christ right now. Yeah. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I'd just like to, say thank you guys for listening. This is our first show, and I just kind of wanted to say, if you guys have any, any advice for us, or if you just want to talk about how it was, or if you have any questions for us, feel free. Yeah,
or any questions you want to send us that you want us to talk about on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
You can email us, or you can reach us. So you can email us at goodisdumbpodcast@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Facebook, Parler, Twitter at goodisdumbpodcast. I think just to echo what you said, thank you for listening. Again, we don't really know how this went because your response is kind of going to determine that. Yeah. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope that God uses this to bless you.
Yeah.
We hope all you dummies out there that fear God more than they fear man are staying strong and just being encouraged that in the end we know who wins. And we know how all this is going to end.
Yeah.
So until next time, stay strong, guys.
Bye, guys.
You've been listening to the Good is Dumb podcast. Check out more of the show on demand at anchor.fm, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Overcast, Castbox, Pocket Casts, SoundCloud, YouTube, or wherever podcasts are found. Also connect with and follow LNCB on Facebook, Parler, and Twitter, at Good is Dumb Podcast.